Welcome to another session of Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. This is AP European History, Chapter 2.2, finishing up the Renaissance. Need to talk about new monarchies, and the reason why we need to talk about new monarchies is there's a trend following the 100 Years' War within England and France, and then also in Spain, to consolidate power. Leaders and other interested parties see a need in formulating strong, centralized nation states. We're not yet to the point of absolute monarchs, but we call these stronger leaders new monarchies. So we're going to take a look at the way in which they develop sovereignty, and so we want to look at specific tactics of a couple leaders within France, Valois France, specifically Louis XI, the Spider King, and then also Henry VII, that would be the Tudor, he said Tudor, dynasty of England, and then Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. Okay, so obviously when we talk about new monarchies, we do need to use that word again, sovereignty, and sovereignty means power, and there are basically, well, there is only one basic way in which a leader is sovereign, and that is he has, or she possesses, a very large standing army. And the only way that that is possible is that they have the freedom to collect taxation. All right, they need tax revenue in order to do that. Because we see the sovereignty growing and the power consolidating in the hands of monarchs, what we have to understand is that power used to be dispersed among the nobility, and so with the advent of these stronger monarchs, what we're going to see is pushback from those noble forces. And so in order to do that, they have to be able to raise taxes. And this is where things get tricky. So you can do it with the consent of the nobility, but you're not going to be as sovereign as you want to be, because you're going to have to share power. The nobility and the representative assemblies or legislative assemblies that are within Europe, you'll find that they'll do so. They'll allow a king perhaps to raise taxes, raise revenue, but they're going to want to have a say in the way that that revenue is spent, or that taxation money is spent. So you're not going to see the creation of a strong sovereign. So they have to be creative. They have to find ways in which to do this, to get around the nobility. And so we're going to see the cooperation between a emerging middle class to create a bureaucratic state. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But the large standing army is going to obviously protect a country's sovereign borders from outside enemies, but it's also going to be used to put down noble wars, or internal squabbles, which is a big hallmark of the Middle Ages. And it's also a king's permanent standing professional army is going to have to be big enough to put down if certain nobles were to join forces, and there would be an insurrection or rebellion, that the monarch would have the strong enough military to put all that down. So that's a little bit of an introduction. It's a little long-winded. I apologize, but that needed to be said. So we specifically want to stress, as I mentioned in the beginning, the intro, Louis XI, Henry VII, and Ferdinand and Isabella, and we're going to give them the title New Monarchs. Okay? So we see the term sovereignty, and then suppressing rebellion, and then subordinating the nobility. That's going to be kind of the hallmark of new monarchs. And they all have their own different way of doing just that. Okay? Let's skip all that. Just go straight to Valois, France. Following the 100 Years' War, which ended when? When did the 100 Years' War end? I'll give you a hint. It's the same year that Constantinople fell. Do you know? Well, I'll tell you. It's 1453. 1453 is when the 100 Years' War ends. And what we see is France in bad shape, depopulated, because that's where the majority of the war was fought, or just pretty much all of it. And so the country was depopulated and weakened, and there was a definite need to bring stability and order to France. And so we're going to see that occur over a period of time. But how you doing, Leland? Lily's come over to say hello. You can hear his click-clacking claws. You okay, Leland? All right, go on. Go lay down. The problem with a unified France is that it's a very large country, and even after there was a bit of rise of nationalism at the end of the 100 Years' War, kind of starting with Joan of Arc, this love of country, this willingness to kick out the invaders, the English invaders. It's more provincial than nationalistic. And what provincialism is, well, if nationalism is this identity of a nation state that, you know, is oftentimes kind of similar to patriotism, love of country, love of nation, love of your ethnic group. Provincialism is something a little bit smaller. Your true loyalty lies to the province that you are from. And because provincialism was very strong in France, we're not going to see total unification for a very long time. It's not there's going to be an absolute monarch, Louis the 14th, who by all standards is probably the strongest absolute monarch. He attempted to bring total unity to France, but he failed ultimately. And it wasn't until a foreign leader by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte in the beginning of the 19th century was able to bring true unification. So it takes a long time, but the process begins with actually prior to Louis the 11th, and starts with Charles the 7th, who is the boy king, the Dauphin, who Joan of Arc is capable of, or successful in helping him rise to the crown during the 100 Years' War. So after the 100 Years' War ends, Charles VII, sees the need to create a unified state, and he takes one important step. And the first important step that he takes is the creation of a permanent standing army. And so he's the very first monarch to do so. So that is noteworthy, okay? Creating a permanent standing army. What we see down here is this Parliament of Paris. Don't get confused with this term. This is spelled differently than the Parliament that we see in England. England's Parliament is a legislative body. France has a legislative body, but it's called the Estates General. This is called the Parliament of Paris. A little bit different. The Parliament of Paris is a court system, and this, along with the Estates General, will more or less undermine the attempts of the monarchs in consolidating power. Okay, so don't get confused by that. We'll mention the Parliament within France, specifically the Parliament of Paris. They're a system of courts. All the major cities had one. It just happens that the one in Paris was the largest and I guess strongest, had the most influence. And these were typically populated by nobles. All right, and so anytime you have kings and nobles, they're going to work against each other. They're going to work against each other probably until the middle of the 19th century, when the masses begin calling for universal suffrage, universal voting rights. It's only then that they decide to work together. But for the time being, they're definitely at odds with one another, and so they're going to try to prevent, one from checkmating each other. All right. So Charles VII was able to bring peace and expel the French. Remember, he's not a very nice guy because he did not pay the Burgundians the ransom that they were charging when they had kidnapped Joan of Arc. So, but at any rate, he does create the first permanent standing army, and he also institutes a two taxes. That what's interesting is this is why he was able to establish a permanent standing army, because the Estates General saw just how. Hold on a second, I gotta hit pause. Okay, sorry for that little brief interruption. I was having some visitors. Anyway, Charles VII. Okay, so he creates a permanent standing army. How is he able to create a permanent standing army if he doesn't have the help of the nobility? Well, the 100 Years' War convinced the nobility that having a permanent standing professional army is in their best interests because of just how much damage was done to their country. And so he was able to convince them to allow him to collect taxation without the consent of the legislative assembly in France, which is called not the Parliament, but the Estates General. Okay? So that's kind of a unique set of circumstances, but it's due to the fact that the country had been decimated by warfare, and so it was an easy enough proposition to get approval for. So he has the ability to raise taxes on certain specific things without the consent of the nobility. All right, and we have the gabelle, which is a salt tax, and then the taille, a land tax, and then a sales tax, which I have no idea. That's French. I have no idea how to pronounce that, nor do I care. Okay. All right. So what he was able to do by doing this was to create a first-rate, very large and powerful state military, and this is a royal army. This is his personal army. Okay, and so this new way of fighting becomes sort of the standard that other countries are going to want to copy. Okay, and remember, he's the first. So this is at the end of the 100 Years' War. So this is mid 15th century, 1450s. Okay, all right, and so we have the new advances in weaponry that are part of this. Okay, so we have the longbow that the French have now finally decided is useful, and then also the cannon. It's a siege weapon, mostly, initially, meaning you use it to attack castles or to attack forts, fixed positions, so it's an offensive weapon. At any rate, what else do we need to see? The creation of a bureaucratic administration. All right, This is also under Charles VII, and so when we say the word bureaucracy or bureaucratic administration, what that means is you are not relying on the assistance of the Legislative Assembly, the legislative body. You are not relying on the nobility. What you are relying on is a new group of governmental officials. And who are these governmental officials? These are people who are usually well educated, and these would be members of the middle class. And they would primarily be lawyers, there were quite a few more lawyers because lawyers were necessary in making contracts that business people would use, enter into contracts with one another. So there were a lot of lawyers, and so lawyers were very useful to the monarchs, and so they began populating their bureaucracies with these lawyers. Now, what is it that this is all based on a give and take. It's a very symbiotic relationship. What is it that the middle class desires? They desire peace and stability. Why? Because you need order in order to conduct business. Commerce does not like constant state of warfare. So they want peace, they want stability. And if a monarch, a sovereign monarch, can deliver that, that to them is most important, because that's going to allow them to make money. So they're going to be willing to offer their services and their loyalty and their support to a monarch if that monarch can deliver. Okay? And then in return, they are granted positions within the government where they can, walk away with a very handsome salary. But then also later, we're going to see the creation of new nobility, a new noble class. And that means there are hereditary titles. That means you can have a legacy. You can pass these things on to your firstborn son. And so that makes it a very attractive position for these business people to become associated with the government and to support the monarch. Okay? And so that is important. All right? And so what we need to move on to then is, these are the things that Charles VII kind of begins and then delivers to his son Louis XI, who is nicknamed the Spider King. Don't really worry about why he has that nickname. But what he does, and he gets a lot of credit because he expands what his father, initiated. Okay? One of the problems that he faced, okay, and here's a map of France, is Burgundy. One of the problems that you have, and I mentioned it earlier, was if a noble has an army and creates, problems for you by staging an insurrection, you have to be able to have a large enough army to put this down. And this was not the case for Louis XI. His standing army that his father bequeathed to him was not strong enough to defeat the forces of Charles the Bold, who was the Duke of Burgundy. Now, when Burgundy, comes onto the scene, it's a very small province within France, but over the years of the 15th century, it becomes a very large region, and it's through marriages and then land acquisition through wars and such that Burgundy becomes a very large force to be reckoned with. And many people at that time feared or believed that it would eventually become a nation state unto itself, so that France would somehow be divided and there would be a France and then a country named Burgundy. But that never came to be. But it does illustrate the problems that, even though, this is the problem for France. It's got such a big kingdom. They don't have the infrastructure, the roads. It takes very, very long for a king to be able to send word, send aid, whatever is necessary to govern such a large area. They didn't really have the resources to be able to do that. So oftentimes what they would rely on would be family members to rule, trust, because you could trust them, and then they would govern as you desire, as the king desired. But over time, over many generations, those family ties or those family relations grow more and more distant. And when that takes place, the willingness of the vassal, if you would, to follow the orders, the instructions of the monarch, that becomes weaker, all right, and doesn't always happen. And so this is why a situation like this occurred in France, okay? So by the time the 15th century comes, well, 1477. By 1477, this is the size of Burgundy, and you can see it's quite large, okay? And as I said, many people believe that it would become a country unto itself. The French monarch did not possess the forces to contain them, nor did the Holy Roman Empire. And as strange as it may seem, Switzerland, which was not a unified state, but did have some Swiss cantons, which are provinces, that were able to join forces and have a sizable enough army to defeat Charles the Bold, and fixed the situation that France and Louis the Spider was able to take advantage of. All right, and so this conflict between the Swiss and the Burgundians was to the advantage and good luck of France. Okay, so this is okay. Yeah, so the Battle of Nancy, strange name for a battle, 1477. Charles the Bold loses, I believe he dies, but it leads to the breakup of the Burgundian kingdom, and France inherits all of its lands. And so this is good, and this is helpful for consolidation purposes of Louis XI, who is seen pictured here in his nice hunting cap that he was frequently seen wearing. Okay. Let's see. When he dies, he bequeaths his successor as his son, Charles VIII. And Charles VIII continues the process of consolidating France that his father and grandfather had started. One of the problems that we're going to see, and we'll talk about this in the last part of the chapter, is the Habsburg-Valois Wars. This was fought for 65 years for controlling influence over the Italian peninsula. And so he gets France involved in this in 1494 when they march into Florence. You might remember that was the time period that Savonarola was the kind of theocratic tyrant leader of Florence, right? That time period. So that's who the French king was that marched in. That's Charles VIII. Okay. One of the other ways that they developed money in this, or not developed money, but developed revenue, was through the sale of these bureaucratic positions within the government, selling them to the highest bidder, and then granting tax-exempt status for your legacy, for your children, so that when they inherit these positions, these will be new titles, it'll be a new form of nobility, and it is a way to raise money on the short end, on the front end, but on the back end, it's an advantage for the purchaser of these titles or offices, because their offspring do not have to pay taxes, because they'll be considered nobility after that. So this is becomes very popular, but it creates problems for all the countries that do this. And France has a major problem with this. We'll talk about this again and again and again, but it starts under Charles VIII. Okay, tax-exempt status for the purchase of governmental offices and titles and things like that. It's a new form of social mobility, and as I said, it creates a new nobility. The last thing that we want to talk about with France, and this is rather significant, was the Concordat of Bologna, which was a treaty, if you will, between Charles VIII and then the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, Leo X. And this agreement was kind of strange, but it grants the monarchy, the French monarchy, more control over the Catholic Church within France's borders by allowing the king to appoint bishops. All right, and this is going to create corruption, because this is a way for a king to appoint his supporters as a reward for loyalty. He's going to appoint people that he wants in the position of bishops, which is a high-ranking ecclesiastical office. Ecclesiastical is a term you need to be familiar with. But in return for that, what the Pope gets, because the Pope wouldn't have agreed to this unless he was getting something in return, each bishop that is appointed by the French king has to give their first year's salary, turn it over to the pontiff in Rome. So it stinks of corruption. All right, so that's the deal. Moving on, the War of the Roses. So one of the problems that England faced was similar to what France faced, and it was, there was a lot of upheaval following the wars, especially since they lost. And we'll just suffice it to say that the loss of the 100 Years' War triggers a civil war within England known as the War of the Roses. Okay, and this is a 30-year struggle for dynastic control over the English crown. Okay, so there's basically two forces that are involved in this. We have the Lancasters and then the Yorks. Okay. What do I want to say about this? I'm not really sure. Okay, so we'll just go through it very quickly. So the reign of King Henry VI, who oversees the defeat of England in the 100 Years' War, is part of the problem for him, and that's going to cause him to be overthrown. He is going to be replaced by Henry VI. Henry VI. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to kind of skip forward to the more interesting part. So the sudden death of Edward VI leads to a resumption of the fighting known as the War of the Roses, because Edward's brother seizes the throne, and this is King Richard III. This is the subject of a pretty famous Shakespearean play, too. There's a lot of what we call intrigue. Intrigue is an important term that's used when the leader constantly faces betrayal by those people kind of in his entourage or his court, those people who want power. This is something that Machiavelli writes a lot about, and that's why you have to have a king who has the power of can be like a lion and a fox, be able to crush your enemies, but also to kind of sniff out and detect those people who are intriguing or conspiring against you. But anyway, King Richard, or Richard III, the brother, seizes the throne and then eliminates the sons of Edward II, because they're the rightful heirs to the throne, and so he has them murdered. He murders his own nephews. Okay, so this is pretty dark stuff. But what ends up happening is there is another struggle for the throne. There rises another group, and this is one of the Lancasterians, Henry Tudor. He mounts an army, and he is able to defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard dies, and this is a big epic moment. But what this does is it not only it brings an end to the Civil War, but it marks the beginning of a new dynasty known as the Tudor dynasty in England. And so Henry will be known as Henry VII. And one of the things that he smartly does is he marries one of the Yorks, Elizabeth of York. And so what that does is, it, in the notes it says it healed the breach between the two factions. It was a very wise move. And so the underlying idea there is that marriages are often done for political alliances, okay, to prevent fighting, to promote peace, okay. And so we see that done there, and there's a picture or a portrait of Henry VII, okay. So he is going to unite England, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do, because Parliament is much, and this is the Legislative Assembly, as I mentioned earlier, is much stronger than the Estates General was in France. But he's able to do it through a group of people known as the gentry. And who are the gentry? These are large landowners who are not nobles. England had very few nobles for all of the different counties or shires that existed within England. And so what Henry uses are these gentries. These are wealthy landowners who do not possess the titles, and he employs their assistants to help govern the various counties and shires around England, and they gain the title Justices of the Peace, right, or JPs, but they are not marrying people, but they are administering justice, okay? So they would go throughout the regions or the various shires or counties, and they would administer justice. And what that means is they would oftentimes render legal decisions or rulings, and these legal decisions and rulings would be recorded, and they would oftentimes influence the decisions of other justices of the peace who might encounter a similar case. All right, and what comes out of that is a very important legal term known as a precedent. And this is something that has influenced our legal system here in the United States. Our Supreme Court relies on precedents. Okay, so for example, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. All right, and that carries tremendous legal sway in our country, this idea of a precedence. So anytime something similar would come up, like another school district chose to remain segregated, the federal government could utilize or could rely on that legal precedent. They wouldn't have to have another court case to decide that another school district would have to desegregate. So the idea of a legal precedence is it's very efficient. And so this idea comes from England, these justices of the peace. And what they end up doing is they begin compiling all of this case law, and it becomes known as common law. All right? Common law. And it develops over time. That's a little bit different than what we see when, with another big contributing force or factor to the Western legal system is Rome. This is different, but the common law develops over time with legal precedences. All right, and so this is something that the justices of the peace did, and what this does is it unites the country legally. That's the importance of this. That's the underlying thing, is that it unites the country legally. Okay. Yep, I think I explained that pretty well. All right, Henry VII. One of the other things that he did was he could not rely. England, throughout its history, has had a very strong has had a very weak army. We'll see very soon that they have a very strong navy. That is going to be kind of like unique to them. They're going to have a strong navy, but they've always had a very small army. And it shouldn't be a surprise then that under Henry VII, they did not have a permanent standing army like we see with Charles VII in France. Okay? No permanent standing army. But what he does though, is he passes laws against livery and maintenance. And what is livery and maintenance? It's the the nobles having armies of their own. These laws were designed to restrict specific nobles from possessing sizable militia armies of their own. All right, that could be used against the king. So that's the idea behind it. He allowed certain nobles to maintain their own private armies, but he hand-picked those people because it was all dependent upon whether or not they were loyal to him. Hopefully that makes sense. So most of the nobles can't have armies. Certain nobles can, and the reason is because they'll lend them to the king if necessary. So it's still kind of a feudal holdover from the Middle Ages, but this is the deal for now. Okay. The other thing that's important that Henry VII utilizes to kind of tame the nobility is a court system known as the Star Chamber. This is a royal court. This is different than the Parliament of Paris. That was populated strictly by nobles. This is a royal court, meaning it's the king. It's a royal court. It's the king has put his hand-selected his judges. All right, and this is a way that he can deliver justice to his realm, and it's specifically used against nobles that are resistant, nobles that are problematic for him. Make sense? Okay, and the beauty of the Star Chamber is there's no jury. The idea with the jury legal tradition, that was among, with the justices of the peace, they would oftentimes, in many of their cases, they would appoint juries. But this is a completely different court system. The Star Chamber does not allow jury trials, so it's up to the judge to render a decision. And if necessary, torture can be used. So this is a way that the Tudor dynasty is able to consolidate power and to kind of limit the power of his nobles. Okay, I know this may not be super exciting, but it is very important stuff, and this is part of the reason why England was able to establish a sovereign state. The Star Chamber will become the subject of a lot of criticism later on because of abuses, but for the time being, it was a necessary evil to bring about sovereignty and to kind of bring peace and stability and order within England. All right, the last topic that we need to discuss is United Spain, and this is going to take place under the joined monarchies of Isabella and of Ferdinand, and they marry in 1469, and it's just what Henry VII did with Mary and Elizabeth of York. They do it to consolidate the state, to create peace. Okay, and so we're going to see this happen oftentimes. But what they were able to do is kind of unite the Iberian Peninsula, which was pretty divided. All right, so we've got Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. All right, and so there you see pictures, or on this map you can see the various major kingdoms. Navarre will remain outside of their control, and then we'll talk a little bit about Granada here in just a moment. All right, so Isabella of Castile marries Ferdinand of Aragon. And so what they're able to do is come together. Their marriage is opposed by the nobles because the nobles see the writing on the wall that what they're trying to do is consolidate power. So this triggers a 10-year civil war within Castile. All right. They're going to have a lot of different tactics that they use in order to create sovereignty in their country. So one of the things that they have to do is they have to work with the legislative assembly that exists in Spain, and that's known as the Cortes. All right, each of the various kingdoms has their own, or region has their own Cortes, and so what they're pretty much having to do is bribe these people, bribe the nobility, and the two ways in which they do this is through giving them positions within the military, giving them high-ranking officer positions within the military in return for their loyalty. Remember, this is all symbiotic. I scratch your back if you scratch mine. And the other way that they tame the Cortes or tame the nobility within Spain or the Iberian Peninsula is by promising them land. All right? And where's that land going to come from? Granada. And we'll talk about that. Let's see. Oh, okay. And then the other thing, too, the Cortes of Castile was dominated by urban representatives. And the urban, what that means is these are people who are important because they're merchants. So they have a lot of money. And what did I say earlier about merchants and commerce? You need peace and stability and order in order for commerce to thrive. And so they're going to side with the monarchs because the monarchs are promising stability, and that's something that is going to help them. All right, and so that's another way that, well, it's not really a way, but that's part of the reason why at least some of the Corteses were willing to work with them. What they created was a bureaucracy, very similar to what was created in England with the justices of the peace. These are called hidalgos. These would be the gentry, essentially, if you want to draw a comparison. A lesser aristocrat who depended heavily on royal favor. Okay, the hidalgos were not tax exempt, so they could be more or less bribed with positions within the government, because those positions within the government could promise later on down the line, like within France, the idea of tax exemption. So this is the way in which you get these smaller aristocrats to support the monarchs, and that is by granting them tax exemption. But more than that, they are going to be offered positions within the bureaucracy, and we'll get to that in just a moment. That term is highlighted in the next couple of slides. One of the other things that is worth mentioning is with the bribes for land of the nobles. Okay, so they're bribing them by some of them offering them positions, like they're the generals within the army, so they get added titles. All right, so that's a way to buy some off, and the other is the promise of land. And of course, Granada, which was a Muslim stronghold that fell in 1492. But then what we see beginning after that is the exploration of the New World, and then once territories began to get carved out, the granting of viceroyalties, or land, the promise of land in the New World, was yet another way to buy off the nobility, all right, and to begin to consolidate power. The other important ploy is through religion, the use of the Catholic Church, the ability to subordinate the Catholic Church within Spain. Spain is obviously will remain a Catholic nation even when we get to the Protestant Reformation. And one of the ways that they do that is by promising the Catholic Church that they were going to bring them converts. All right. Oh, here's the term I mentioned earlier with the hidalgos. So the hidalgo would be like a gentry, and then a corregidor would be this new royal official, very similar to the justice of the peace in England. So the corregidor. All right. They were able to raise money through the creation of a sales tax, alcabala. All right, and so this was important to the creation of a permanent standing army. All right. So what they did was they subordinated the Catholic Church, and also grew a lot of internal support from their subjects. They grew very popular among their subjects because inside of Spain it was not a completely homogeneous population. What I mean by that is there were significant minority groups. One of them, Jews, about 150,000 Jews, and then Muslims, all right, which their number, I would assume, would be quite a bit larger than that. So these were two significantly sized minority groups. And you don't see that traditionally in Europe, their countries, everybody's the same. Everybody's homogeneous, but here it's heterogeneous population. And so what the country does is it basically forces the people to rally around the monarchy, because the monarchy is trying to bring unity to the country. And they do it through religion, okay? They try to create religious unity within the country in the hopes of that creating political unity, because the wisdom, the conventional wisdom at this time period suggests that if everybody's not the same religion, that is opening the door to potential rivalries and rebellion. So if you want to be united and create and prevent rebellion, you have to have everybody the same religion. All right. Not only do they create religious unity, they are doing things that are very pleasing to the Catholic Church, because they are bringing to the Catholic Church forced converts. And in return for forcing Jews and Muslims, because this is what I'm getting to, the Jews and the Muslims have to they're forcibly converted to Catholicism. In return, the Spanish monarchy is going to want basically the same thing that Charles VIII with the Concordat of Bologna got in France, and that is they get to make appointments and they get to oversee the Catholic Church within Spain. Okay? So what they do is they expel all of the Jews that are unwilling to convert to Catholicism. And so what we see is this is what we would sort of refer to as the diaspora of the Spanish Jews and where they go. Some of them go to North Africa, but many of them go to other parts of Europe, and some of them will go even here in Amsterdam or the Netherlands, the Low Countries, and we'll find that there is some religious toleration. There's not religious toleration around Europe. This part is very sparsely populated, and this is, Poland and Eastern Europe. And when we get to World War II and talk about the Holocaust, this is the area that became depopulated of Jews, and this is why they're there to begin with. All right, a big reason is because of the diaspora. Their ancestors came from Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, now these Jews are oftentimes very highly skilled professionals, wealthy, and this forced conversion or expulsion creates what we know as a brain drain. And it creates future challenges for Spain because they do not have a tremendous number of highly skilled people in their workforce, and that's because of that. But they get permission from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does not perform the Inquisition inside of Spain. Spanish clergy members do, okay? And this is, the Spanish Inquisition is kind of infamous, notorious, for the torture and execution of people who were believed to have been fake converts. All right, so we have conversos, or Jews that have been forced to convert, and then and then the Muslims were known as Moriscos, and essentially they were being charged with heresy for falsely practicing Catholicism, like like that they were secretly practicing their own religion. So they gave them a choice. You're either converting or you have to leave. And so many converted, but the idea is that some did not. From what I've read, that a lot of the torture and the terrible bloodshed that took place is a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know if that's of any significance, but this is, I guess, the latest version, of this story. All right, and so what we see here is the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. This color here, whatever color that is for you, I don't know. I have no idea what color that is, but this was under the control of the Muslims. All right, so we see 10th century, 12th century. So the Reconquista is basically a holy war. This is a crusade to regain control. Okay, and in 1492 they complete the Reconquista, and so the Muslims that live there are subject to the same types of conditions that the Jews have already been subjected to. And so what we have is religious persecution, and then the word that does not exist yet is religious tolerance. Religious tolerance, the idea of religious tolerance is not going to come around until the 18th century, all right, not until the 1700s. So we've got a couple hundred years to go before anybody considers religious toleration. So most kings you're going to see, most monarchs are going to say everybody's got to be the same religiously or face persecution. All right, that is all we've got, and I said about 30 minutes. I lied. Sorry about that, but there's a lot of important information in there. And even though the questions on the study guide don't necessarily bear that out, this is a pretty heavy topic, and it kind of lays the groundwork for absolutism, which is a huge unit. So I think this is time well spent, because we've really hammered out a lot of important basic concepts as far as sovereignty and consolidation of power goes, and religion and stuff like that. So please do save this. Do not be afraid to review this and watch this again. The last thing I want to say is make sure you subscribe to my page so that you can receive updates as soon as I put these videos and make them available. All right, thank you.